Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now this is one of my favourite budget gaming processors. There's no definitive justification for why I really like this CPU other than the fact I owned one for a couple of years in the early 2020s and it could play everything I wanted with decent frame rates. So I was pretty excited when I found one of these inside the Aldi grocery store PC we looked at in the previous video, though it was held back quite significantly by the GTX 1650 it was paired with. The 10400 was Intel's answer to AMD's formidable Ryzen 5 3600, while 8th and 9th gen Intel CPUs finally brought 6 physical cores to the i5 lineup. 10th gen introduced hyper-threading. The 10400 was available in a few variants: the standard chip that we have here, the F version which lacked integrated graphics and sold for slightly less, as well as the T version which has lower clocks and reduced power draw. At first, prices for the standard 10400 and Ryzen 3600 were quite similar. But 2020 and the years that followed were pretty rough for PC hardware to say the least, and the 10400, especially the F version, soon became much cheaper. Sure, it was the more locked down chip, it lacked overclocking and limited memory speeds on cheaper boards, but it still came very close to the AMD Ryzen in games. Now these days the 10400 is quite hard to justify because of pricing and availability. It seems rather scarce on the used market, especially when compared to the 3600, and it is more expensive. Not to mention that Socket 1200 certainly hasn't benefited from the same incredible run of support as AM4. That said, I still want to take a look at it because it really surprised me over the last few days. Sure, on paper, it makes sense to buy the Ryzen 3600 instead, but let's give this old 10th gen chip the spotlight today and see what it can actually do. I started off by pairing it with a very capable 1080p graphics card, the Radeon RX 7600. This is the sort of card that represents a realistic modern choice. Going with anything higher end won't make much sense, as the i5 would potentially hold it back quite significantly. A CPU bottleneck here will still be the case most of the time, but from what I found, this pairing actually handled itself quite well. I'm also using 16 gigs of 2666 MHz DDR4, that's two 8GB sticks in dual channel mode with a basic B460 board. Now first of all, here we have Battlefield 6, and you're going to notice that the CPU is pretty much pegged to at least 90% utilisation most of the time. This isn't something that's too uncommon in a lot of the lower end chips that I test, and if we look at the GPU utilisation, that's sitting at least 90% as well a lot of the time. So overall this isn't a bad pairing, and the game's actually running quite well with minimal stutter, at least on the surface, and the exact on-screen figures don't show me any signs of horrific stutter or slowdown. We saw 88 as an average with a 1% low of 60 and a 0.1% low of 54. Counter-Strike 2 performed quite well also, and we're going to see average performance of at least 60 frames per second. We were in fact looking at double that most of the time, triple that in fact. 180 was the average, though the percentile lows weren't brilliant. We're looking at 88 as that 1% low with a 0.1% figure of 21. So the occasional hiccup here and there, but for the most part it was more than playable. As you can see from the footage, I'm just getting wiped out most of the time, so it's not that exciting to look at from a gameplay perspective, but I hope you still get a good idea of performance. When it comes to GTA 5 Enhanced, well, we have the high RT preset enabled, so ray tracing was on here, and we also have RTGI, or ray traced global illumination, set to high, as this is the biggest visual transformation as far as I'm concerned with the settings. Switching this on completely transforms the way this game looks, and with the i5 10400 and 7600 combo, we were getting 99 frames per second overall with a 1% low of 79 and a 0.1% low of a very nice 69, so fairly smooth. There will be the occasional little dip here and there, especially when venturing into specific areas, but most of the time, as you can see, it ran really nicely, and our GPU was pretty much maxed out here. The i5 has an all-core clock of 4 GHz, which it's sitting at comfortably with a standard cooler. Next up we have Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 1080p here with the high preset. SMAA2TX was also enabled, and here we saw another solid average of 79 frames per second this time around. Again, the percentile lows were pretty good, 68 as the 1% low and 64 as that 0.1% low. So I really cannot complain about the performance of Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 with this aging processor. Now Fortnite did have a few problems. We're running with high preset, but Nanite was switched off and therefore so was Lumen. I have TAA enabled as well, and with our 7600 we're getting a decent average with the i5 10400 machine, but our percentile lows do leave a little to be desired. A 1% low was 60, but that 0.1% low of just 6.3 tells us that there were a few moments whereby the game wasn't 100% smooth. It's not completely uncommon for Fortnite, and as you can hopefully see from the footage, most of the time it ran fine and I was able to have a decent gameplay experience here, even though I didn't win. Cyberpunk 2077 also runs surprisingly well on the 7600, but more so on the 10400 here. I'm using the high preset with medium crowds by default, and that certainly helps in those more intensive areas where there are a lot more NPCs on screen. Even so, I was surprised to see that with Cyberpunk here, our GPU was actually hitting at least 95% utilization, and our CPU wasn't being completely choked. Now for the last of the 7600 benchmarks, we have Forza Horizon 6 here, 89 FPS as an average, 1% low of 69, very nice, and a 0.1% low of 55, so again, pretty smooth for the most part. I noticed the occasional little dip here, and with a newer or more powerful processor, you're probably going to notice improvements to things like the percentile lows or the smoothness and consistency of certain games. But again, the 10400 here, the 10th gen chip, is holding up absolutely fine. Not bad at all from the 10400. Now if you are pairing one with a modern entry level or lower mid-range card, then you may be pleasantly surprised, even if you are using a basic board with 2666 MHz RAM like I've done today. For a CPU at this price point, it's aged pretty well. It still feels very snappy under Windows 11, which it fully supports, and I even edited and rendered this video with it. Rendering wasn't that quick, as you can imagine, but DaVinci Resolve in general felt absolutely fine. At this point I was getting a little curious about how the performance of this 10th gen part compared to a modern i5, another CPU that is near the top of my list of favourites, my daily driver, the 12400F. For the following comparisons, I swapped the RX 7600 out for the mid-range 16GB Radeon RX 9060 XT. I tested at 1080p once again to better highlight any performance changes between the two generations of processor. The on-screen footage is once again from the 10400 with comparative results on screen too. I have just a few examples, but you can pretty much get a good idea of what's occurring here. So Forza Horizon 6 1080p with the Extreme preset and TAA gave us 71 FPS on average with the 10400, a 1% low of 52 and a 0.1% low of 44. The i5 12400F meant that we saw at least 30 frames per second more on average with a frame rate of 107, a 1% low of 92 and a 0.1% low of 84, so improvements across the board, not just to the overall experience but to the consistency and smoothness of the game as well. But not a bad effort from the 10400, I'm sure you'll agree. Battlefield 6 here with the 10400 produced 80 frames per second, with the 9060 XT in the system of course, a 1% low of 58 and a 0.1% low of 51, so not bad. Pretty smooth, no major flaws here with performance. The 12400F once again blasted past 100 frames per second, though perhaps blasted past is a bit generous, 102 FPS on average with percentile lows of 71 and 64 respectively. So not a huge amount of difference as far as the percentile lows are concerned, and this one is rather CPU intensive, especially in those bigger maps with a lot more players on screen. GTA 5 Enhanced 61 FPS with the 10400 and the maximum RT preset, a 1% low of 49 and a 0.1% low of 45. The 12400F hit 85 FPS, so 25 frames per second more, with improved percentile lows as well of 67 and 60. Counter-Strike 2 at 1080p with a very high preset and MSAA off hit 222 frames per second with the old i5 10400, and by comparison we saw 290 frames per second with the 12400F. Of course the percentile lows were also improved, but not by as much of a margin here, up from 110 and 81 to 141 and 95 respectively here. And finally, for the comparative 9060 XT results, we have 62 FPS for Cyberpunk with the 10400, a 1% low of 42 and a 0.1% low of 33. I used the Ultra preset here and therefore the crowd density option was set to high, and in fairness both CPUs will struggle a little bit with the high crowd density. It's quite a CPU intensive option. Even so, the 12400F pulled ahead once again, as expected, 79 FPS on average, with 1% lows up from 42 and 33 to 50 and 38, so not a significant change, but a noticeable one, even when you're playing. Now once again the 10400 surprised me, even if the comparative results didn't. In some cases the 9060 XT was still hitting at least 95% utilisation, so upgrading to a modern card like this wouldn't be a terrible idea. But it is worth noting that you will leave some performance on the table, and in some cases quite a lot of it. Those generational gaps will probably be even more noticeable if you pair it with a high-end GPU, which of course I wouldn't recommend. Our standard 10400 also has integrated graphics, and we mustn't forget about those, as they do come in handy sometimes. We have UHD 630 graphics here. Now it won't be able to pump out 60 FPS in modern titles, but when it comes to games like Minecraft using the fast preset at 1080p, 60 FPS plus is possible. You shouldn't have much trouble with an older games collection either. Still, I don't think the iGPU is enough reason to buy one of these over a 3600 or something newer, better, and only slightly more expensive. If you happen to find a low-cost pre-built with one of these inside, then it will still make an acceptable starting point for a budget gaming PC. Just make sure you have dual channel RAM, preferably 16GB of this stuff. And if you have a single 8GB stick, well, upgrade to 16 as soon as possible if you can, of course. But that's all for this one. Thank you as always for watching. Let me know your thoughts down below, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.